Jimmy Butler and Paul George are some of the best two-way players in the NBA today, and with these two sharing a similarity, it's made me think, who's better? And that's exactly what I'll be trying to answer in today's video, so let's get into it. Firstly, let's look at face value stats. At the time of this recording, Paul George is averaging 24 points, 6 rebounds and 5 assists, whilst Butler is averaging 21 points, 7 rebounds and 7 assists. Both have great stats, and they actually are even, as each player takes 4 categories here, so this technically is a tie. However, I will give my thoughts on these stats and what I consider better here. So Jimmy averages less points than PG, but PG actually averages 3 more shot attempts per game than Butler, so if Jimmy attempted the same amount of shots, then I think he would be averaging more points than Paul George. Another thing I need to address is Jimmy Butler's steals and 3-point percentage. Jimmy is currently leading the league in steals, which is incredible, and he's the only player averaging more than 2 steals per game. So with the positive out of the way, we need to look at the negative also. His 3-point percentage is awful, but there are reasons to this. The biggest being his style of play, which I will talk about in my next category, and that's offense. Offense for me is broken down into 3 subcategories: scoring, playmaking and clutch. Firstly, let's look at scoring. I'll take a look at each player's shot charts first to grasp more of a feel for their game and to work out their percentages also. You can see immediately here that Paul George is way more of a versatile scorer than Butler, and this reflects in their styles of play. Before I carry on, the shade of blue for the dotted areas correlate to how well a player shoots from that area. The lighter the blue, the worse they shoot. The darker the blue, the better they shoot. Now with that out of the way, you can see that Paul George not only shoots more threes, but is extremely efficient from there too. If you look at Butler's chart however, you can see that he's predominantly scoring in the paint and hitting a few mid-range shots too. However, this doesn't mean he isn't a versatile scorer. In these videos, I try and only use stats and information from this season because I want to compare how good each player currently is. But for me to explain that Jimmy is a versatile scorer, I have to tell you about last season, and in particular, the finals. In the finals against the Lakers, Butler lit them up. When I watched him play, he was just hitting everything. He can hit the mid-range shots, and he will hit the threes when they're needed. And this shot chart doesn't truly reflect Jimmy's versatility. Now with that explained, let's look at their percentages from all 3 levels. You can see that from the percentages, PG is clearly the more efficient scorer. But like I said, don't overlook Jimmy, because if you need a bucket, he'll go get you one. So for scoring, I think everyone can agree that PG is the more versatile and more efficient scorer, so he takes the edge in my opinion. My next defensive category is playmaking. The stats I'm going to use here are assists and assist percentage. Assist percentage is the percentage of the team's assists that player was responsible for during his time on the court. Looking at the stats, again it's clear to see who's the winner here, and this time it's Butler. Jimmy has an absurd 36.7% for his assist percentage. This is currently 8th in the NBA, and he's not even a point guard. But for these first 2 categories, I could have told you this myself, because Butler is an all-around, get everything done type of player, and he has his hands on all facets of the game. This shows through his averages, and his 4 triple-doubles this season also. Paul George, on the other hand, is much more of a scorer, and his role on the Clippers is to be one of the primary bucket getters. So scoring goes to PG, and playmaking goes to Butler. Now on to clutch. For this, we have to determine a period of time where players can come up as quote-unquote clutch. This is generally in the last 5 minutes of a game, when that player's team is either up or down by 5 points. Any basket here is classed as clutch. I'm going to look at 3 time periods: the last 5 minutes, the last minute, because that's when the game is basically on the line, and the last 30 seconds, which is basically the last possession of a game. So for every time period, the game is technically getting tighter. So here are the stats for the last 5 minutes. For the first time in this series, I've added rebounds and assists to clutch, and that's because I believe they are clutch stats as they impact the game. An assist is a basket that player was responsible for, and a rebound gives your team an extra possession. So now with these new added stats, you can see that Butler impacts the last 5 minutes more than PG, even though PG has slightly better shooting numbers from 3 and the free throw line. Then we move on to the last minute. We see a big shift here as Butler's performance largely drops off, so this tells me that he gets a lot of the work done in those 4 minutes to elevate his team to a point where they aren't in danger anymore. PG also elevates his game, and his shooting percentages are great, not only here but in the final 30 seconds. As you can see here, PG is just great in the clutch, especially this season. So overall for stats wise, PG clearly takes the cake, but I will say that the workload that Butler puts in during those final 5 minutes is massive, so both players are clutch, but PG is able to show up in every time period, and that's the difference. Now with offense out of the way, let's look at defense. For this, I'll look at 4 stats: steals, blocks, defensive rating, and defensive win shares. Defensive rating is the number of how many points that player would allow to be scored in 100 possessions. So the lower the number, the better. Then defensive win shares is just the number of games a player has helped his team win due to his defense. So this number you want as high as possible. Defensive rating you want low, defensive win shares you want high. Looking at the stats, you can see that Butler is the better defender, and I think he has the edge over him for a few more reasons. One big one is because of his offense. You see, Butler isn't having to carry both ends of the floor. He's not having to average 30 points to keep his team alive. And so the slower approach on offense, especially with playmaking, gives him the advantage on defense, because he isn't expending as much energy on offense, which I think Paul George does a lot more, but that's both players' choices and their play styles. So personally, I agree. I think that Butler is a better defender than George. Now with offense and defense out of the way, let's look at value. Value is tricky because stats sometimes don't do it justice. But let me show you the stats. The Clippers are currently 43-19 and sit 3rd in the West, whilst the Heat are 32-29 and sit the 7th seed in the East. That's a big difference, don't get me wrong, and so on paper you would say that the Clippers are better and PG is more valuable. But both players have missed quite a lot of games, so the real way to measure this is by looking at their records when they actually play, whilst also seeing what their team's record is when these players sit out. You can see that when PG plays, they win 74% of their games, which is higher than when Butler plays, which is 60%. However, there is only an 18% drop off when Paul George sits out. That's a big difference to Butler. When Butler sits out, their chance of winning drops off by nearly 30%. So when Butler plays, he basically doubles his team's chances of winning, and that's how you've really got to look at it. If you took Butler off that Heat team, there would be a group of young players, but if you take PG off the Clippers, they would still have Kawhi, who can lead a team. So in my opinion, taking stats out of it, Jimmy Butler is just straight up so much more valuable to his team. I did say earlier that I don't like bringing up previous seasons, but just look at last year. Jimmy Butler was the heart and soul of that Miami Heat team, and they made it to the finals. Without him, they'd be lost in my opinion. But if you want even more stats to solidify my position on value, here are their win shares. Butler has been responsible for 2 more wins than George, and here are their stat categories that each player leads their team in. Butler is just everything to the Heat, and it's not even a debate, in my opinion, that he's more valuable. But with that out of the way, let's look at the final overview. We had stats, then we had offense, which was broken down into scoring, playmaking and clutch, and then we moved on to defense, and finally we had value. Starting with the stats, these players were even, but I could give the edge to Butler because he attempts less threes and just shots in general, but still averages nearly the same amount of points, whilst doubling George's steals and averaging 0.1 less blocks. But I'll call it a tie anyway. Then we had scoring. Here I gave the edge to PG. He's a lot more versatile and is a more efficient scorer too. After that we had playmaking. Here it was obvious that Butler was the better playmaker, and so this one goes to him. Finally, for offense, we finished with clutch. I gave the edge to PG for the sole reason that he shows up through all time periods, but I will say that you could argue Butler is more clutch because he gets a lot more of the work done before the game goes down to the wire. But clutch went to PG. Moving on from offense, we had defense. Here I gave it to Butler. He currently leads the league in steals and beats George in defensive rating and defensive win shares. Then last but not least, we had value. I gave you the stats and quite a long opinion on why Butler is more valuable. That argument was mainly my opinion, I do understand that, but the stats backed my point, so I'm sticking with it. So overall, Butler is the better player. I came into this video personally preferring Butler as a player, but I was open-minded to seeing if PG was actually better, and if there was actually a huge difference. But honestly, there isn't a massive difference. I do feel though that the categories Butler beat PG in, he beat him by a lot. However, that's the stats and my opinion. What do you think? Do you think differently? Did I miss anything out? If I did, please let me know in the comments below because I want to make these videos as fair as possible. But for my final thoughts, I think Butler is better, but I also think PG is having a great season. I'm excited to see both players in the playoffs, and I'm excited to see PG come back and show us that last year was a major one-off. If he lives up to what he's been saying, then we're going to be in for a treat in the playoffs, and we could see the Clippers crowned as champions. But anyways guys, that's going to wrap it up for today's video. Thanks so much for watching, I hope you have enjoyed, and if you did, a like and subscribe would help the channel out massively. The support recently has been amazing and I can't thank you guys enough. But that's all from me. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.